Hey, what's up, guys? Metal571 here, and today we're going to be talking about the AKG K812. It's been quite a challenge to get my hands on one of these, but I finally have one for review. So what is this for? This is a professional master reference open back, basically a top-of-the-line open dynamic from AKG. And I believe they were the last ones to come out with a flagship dynamic after the HD800, which spurred the Biodynamic T1 and the K812's creation. And so let's talk about the build quality. I think there's a good use here of metal and really strong plastics. I would hope, since this thing MSRP runs around $1,500, so yeah, and you would hope that it would have some good build quality. It does. Not really any major complaints from me, except the headband adjustments are real weird. Like these guys, you kind of push on the cymbal, and then you can slide it up and down, but it just sounds cheap, and it could have been better. Is really what it comes down to. I just found it bizarre how such an expensive headphone has such a bizarrely cheap feeling adjustment for the headband. But hey, at least the headband itself is very comfortable, and so are the pads. Like I said, there's plenty of metal and plastic in use here, which makes it a little bit heavy, but not that bad compared to some of the really heavy stuff like Odyssey makes. So yeah, it's pretty decent. So for comfort, though, I think these ear pads are a genius design. So these sound sealing, quote unquote, ear pads have this asymmetrical shape here that goes and seals behind the back of your ear, which does a really good job, which I'll talk about in the sound section that's coming. And I like how, of course, you have a lot of adjustment for sealing against the side of your head on both ears here. And yeah, I think as far as comfort goes, this is probably one of the most comfortable and best designed headphones on the market, maybe ever. And that's all I'd say about build and comfort. Now we have to talk about before we go into sound to sound, I wanted to say the cable, though, unfortunately is a little subpar, because I don't know how many AKGs you guys have owned, but I have had quite a few, and this is the same jack ending here with the same 1/4-inch adapter that is on like a K701. In fact, this is the same one that's even on the K240. I would have expected a much nicer cable for this price, but it's basically the same cable, except it's terminated differently in this weird proprietary connector. So yes, it is removable as well, so there's that advantage, but the disadvantage is it's very hard to make this thing balanced if you wanted to recable it for balanced, because there's only three conductors on the cable, so it'll take some serious work getting that to work. Okay, now enough about the build and comfort. Now we got to talk about the sound of this thing. So what does the A12 really sound like? There have been so many varying reviews saying, oh, it's amazing, totally worth the money. And then there's Tile's review, which many of you have probably seen a long time ago when this headphone came out, saying, oh, it's not even close to being worth the money. So let's start with the bass here. So like the K712, this headphone also has a very wide hump in the bass, probably centered around 200 to 300 hertz at the top of the hump, but it extends extremely well, almost as good as a planar into the bass region, which I found really good. However, on the downside, the harmonic distortion is HD600 or HD650 like, so it's not quite there. The HD800 has an unusual ability to do bass and to do it cleanly, because its harmonic distortion is very low in the bass for being an open back dynamic, which is very unusual because it's pretty natural to have a boost in the harmonic distortion as you go lower in frequency after the primary resonance of the driver. And yeah, these have a decent amount of harmonic distortion down there. So It's not unexpected, but compared to the 800, managed to figure out how to do it without the harmonic distortion, so it sounds cleaner in the bass. This one not quite as clean, but it does extend really well. And of the three, the T1, the 800, and the 812, this has the most bass and digs probably the deepest. So there is that advantage. That's probably the highlight of the sound, which you'll notice as we go on here. So let's talk about the mid-range next. Now, I think the timbre of the mids, in terms of where the peak is located, is about right. But the problem with the mids on this thing is you have a very, very narrow peak between. You have a narrow peak around 3 or 4K, but it's narrow. That's the problem, because what you want to look at a graph is you want to see a gently rising slope into the upper mids. And these are just like flat, 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 flat. Okay, here's a sudden peak. And so it sounds odd. It doesn't have the warmth to the mids that it really should have in an organic manner, and you can really hear that. But other than that, actually, there isn't any significant detail problem with the mids. I found the mids here quite... even though they're aggressive, they're quite clean for what I expected compared to the treble, which I will talk about in a second. But the mids here the voicing is just not that warm, but the peak that's supposed to happen is a little bit above neutral. I would say probably maybe like 3 dB above where it should be, so guitars can be a bit harsh, but it's nothing compared to the treble, because in the treble, this thing is going to sear your head off. This is a very, very bright headphone. There's no way to get around that. We'll talk about that again in genre pairing when I go there, but there's a very strong 6K peak on this headphone. Very, very strong. And to make it even worse, there's tons of haze, lots of hashiness to the highs. My words I use in my notes here: sloppy, hashy, hazy sounding. So yeah, I actually completely agree. That would put me in agreement with Tile. This headphone does not have the kind of micro detail that you can get in the 800. The 800 is like, oh, hey, look at me. I have a lot of detail, and I also have a 6K peak. But the difference is this headphone is faking the detail, and that one actually has it, which is immediately noticeable with EQ, which is one of the advantages as to someone who equalizes a lot. I can tell very quickly that equalizing this thing just does not at all have really great benefits on the 812. It may make it more listenable, but man, it's still really low resolution here in the treble compared to the 800. It's just simple fact. And I totally agree with Tile on that. So what I heard was a large 6K peak, a little bit higher than the 800s actually, and then another 10K peak after that, which is not too surprising. A lot of diffuse field equalized headphones try to have those two peaks. But in my opinion, I think this thing sounds like a Chinese knockoff of an HD800 sound signature. So that's kind of what you're getting here in the treble. The soundstage, on the other hand, I thought the imaging was quite good, quite a bit better than a mid-fi headphone would be, like a DT880 or a HD600 or something like that. Quite a bit better imaging, but it's still not quite as precise as the HD800, where you can really have this holographic weird thing like that. That saxophone is coming from that direction. You can like point at it almost. This one not quite as good. But it's up there. It had a decent amount of separation. It just wasn't on quite the same level as the 800. The width is actually very good here too, and it kind of has a bit of that AKG style. Look at me, I have a really wide presentation kind of a thing, kind of like the K701, K702, that line. They do that too, but I think the imaging was a little bit better, a little bit more precise. So it definitely passes the soundstage test for something this expensive, because it is very expensive. Better than your average mid-fi, that's for sure. But I think it falls flat in terms of the sound signature and detail. It just does not have what it takes to compete at this price range. Isolation, for those who don't know, this is an open back headphone, meaning there is absolutely none. You cannot wear this in the library. Don't bring this on the train. Don't bother the crap out of people by playing your music through it. They will hear everything that you play through this. Genre pairing, without any EQ of any kind, and even with EQ, most modern music is, in my notes I wrote, completely unlistenable, and I totally stand by that. It is just really bright. You can't really turn it much up at all without your ears getting hit by that 6K peak big time. I can really only tolerate things like jazz and classical on this, unless you're correcting with EQ, and then you're just missing out on a lot of detail. And why did you buy this when you could have just gotten a K712? That's kind of my ending conclusion there. Amp needs. Actually, this is an interesting one. This is actually a 36 ohm headphone, believe it or not. And it'll run off a phone. You can actually run this off a phone, which is weird because you can't say that about any of the other top of the line dynamics. The 800 is a 300 ohm headphone. The Biodynamic T1, 600 ohm headphone. So this thing is weird in that it has a very low impedance and will run off a phone reasonably well, but still not like you really want to do that. But anyway, conclusions overall. Why was this headphone made? I don't understand how AKG's engineers made this driver, put it in this enclosure, listened to it, and said, okay, that's worth $1,500. Wrong. I just I do not understand this. And it's going to really disappoint a lot of people thinking, okay, this headphone costs this much, it should be at least good. No. The treble here is so far behind in resolution compared to the HD800 and the T1 that it's almost laughable. And anyone who pays more than, I'd say, $400 or $500 for this headphone, you're being ripped off. And even if you do pay that much for it, why? Why wouldn't you just buy a K712? I mean, it is a little bit more colored signature, the 712 that is, versus this, but it's so much more detail. In fact, the 712, in my review of that, which you can also find on my channel, I clearly said that it has more detail and more speed and is even more equalizable than the HD600 and HD650, which is a good feat to be accomplishing here. So I maintain that the K712 and also the K553, which I now own, which basically sound the same as my old K550, are by far the best current AKG headphones out there, I would say. So if you're thinking about buying this, don't do it. That's really what I'm going to end this review by saying. And it actually annoys me to a decent degree that they're charging as much as they are for this thing. They're just ripping people off. They should be buying a K712. K's closed, guys. That's the K812. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next review.